Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, coronavirus lockdowns in Israel are extended by 10 days. Meanwhile, incoming Secretary of State in the U.S., Antony Blinken, lays out the Biden administration's foreign policy. And finally, to life, l'chaim, Israeli pensioners partying as they celebrate their newfound immunities. I feel like a broken record, but coronavirus infections still ballooning every day. Officials counting the highest daily spread rate since the start of the pandemic, and government ministers are now extending lockdowns by another week and a half. Chana Rifkin reporting.
The coronavirus cabinet voting unanimously overnight to extend Israeli lockdown measures by another 10 days, the new scheduled end being the 31st of January. And this as Israel sets yet another 24-hour record for infections, with 30 to 40% of all new infections coming from the new, more infectious UK mutation. New cases now bringing active totals up past 83,300, with 1,185 serious cases and a record 309 people ventilated. The death toll rising again to 4,144.
זה הצלת חיים ומניעת קריסת מערכת הבריאות. שום שיקול אחר. אני יודע שזאת החלטה קשה לרבים מאזרחי ישראל, אבל נדרש כאן מאמץ אחרון, מאמץ משותף של כולנו, כדי לצאת מהקורונה, להציל חיים.
That said, some considerations and exceptions have been made, in addition to extending lockdowns to January 31st. Students without access to remote learning will be able to physically go to school for exams as long as they don't exceed 5% of the population capacity. Similarly, 11th and 12th grade students will be able to attend school for matriculation exams, according to regulations that have yet to be determined. And as for travel, all incoming flights to Israel will require a recent negative coronavirus test or proof of either recovery or vaccination issued by the health ministry. And this applies to all travelers who've been away from Israel for 3 days or more, except for air crew members who will be in Israel for 72 hours or more and individuals with special permits. Anyone arriving in Israel without a negative virus test is subject to a fine of 2,500 shekels, or about $772. Now, meanwhile, with lockdowns buying time, Israel's vaccination program is also continuing strong. Over 2.2 million Israelis, or over 25% of the population, have been vaccinated already, nearly 500,000 of whom have received their second and final doses. And the program has now been extended to the 40-plus age group, with aims of giving out 250,000 shots per day.
And joining me now to help us understand Israel's situation just a little bit better is Professor Cyril Cohen, head of the immunotherapy lab at Bar Ilan University. Now, Professor Cohen, the vaccination campaign is arguably very successful, and we are in a strict lockdown nonetheless, and as cases continue to balloon. What's going on?
You know, basically, we have to understand that this is biology. We cannot expect a full vaccination program to be effective the day after, you started it, or even a month, because we know that these things take time. It's like, if you go to the gym, you don't expect to look like, Arnold Schwarzenegger after 2 days when you trained. So we know that for the vaccine to be fully effective, you need to get the 2 doses and then again wait around 1 to 2 weeks. And therefore, this lapse of time hasn't passed. And therefore, on the one hand, we are very concerned by the very high number of cases in Israel and also severe cases. On the other hand, we are maintaining our vaccination program so that we'll be able, I guess, hopefully in 2 to 3 weeks, to see the results of that program.
All right, now, luckily, with respect to the vaccinations, most officials are fairly confident that these new RNA vaccines will be effective against new mutations of the virus, including the more infectious UK mutation, which is quickly becoming the dominant strain of infection here in Israel. What makes us so confident in that respect?
So basically what we know from preliminary evidences and studies that were done in the United States is that the vaccine, as least in its present form, is supposed to give some high level of protection against what we call the British variant. Now, the question is what is going to happen with the South African variant and the Brazilian variant. We don't have evidence that the Brazilian variant is already in Israel, but we know for sure that the South African is already in Israel. And here there are some conflicting reports about, the extent of protection provided by the vaccine, though we can be, I would say, confident to some extent the vaccine will protect, perhaps fully protect against the South African variant.
All right, now, finally, we've seen pretty alarming reports of infections in pregnant women. What makes pregnant women more prone to severe versions or illness from the virus?
So we know that basically, pregnant women are more, I would say, susceptible to respiratory illnesses. We also know that to some extent their immune system is a little bit downregulated in order to accept the fetus developing. So that makes pregnant women, I would say, more susceptible to diseases. But here, what we know is that while the frequency of, I would say, infection is comparable to women at the same age that are not pregnant, in pregnant women, COVID-19 can be more severe, at least in 10 to 15% of the pregnant women. And therefore, that's what we are, of course, afraid of is going to happen. And we have seen in the past few days several cases of pregnant women that had to be delivered so that, we can save the baby and in parallel treat them.
All right, well, we certainly hope that more people will get vaccinated, pregnant or otherwise. Professor Cohen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Now, messages of hope aside, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also warning of an iron fist that is set to come down on lockdown breakers, particularly following the latest mega wedding reported in the ultra-Orthodox city of Bnei Brak Monday evening. Videos of the wedding drawing outrage from across the entire political spectrum.
אני מצפה מכולכם לשים את החיים לפני הכל ולתמוך בהחלטה הנכונה. אני קורא לכל האזרחים, גם אלה שהשתתפו אתמול בחתונה שערורייתית בבני ברק, להפסיק להפר את החוק. זו שפיכות דמים, ואני קורא למשטרה לנקוט יד ברזל נגד כל מפירי החוק באשר הם.
Even Haredi Shas party leader Aryeh Deri is saying that the wedding desecrated God's name and tainted the ultra-Orthodox image by their breaking of the commandments to be careful with life. But in fact, most of the infections in the country continue to stem, unfortunately, from the ultra-Orthodox community, with the Haredi sector making up 40% of reported COVID cases, despite accounting for just 15% of the general population. So, why the continuing conflict between ultra-Orthodox members of society and communities and national coronavirus restrictions, especially as the Haredi population is most devastated by such actions? Joining me to discuss is former head of the Israeli Chief Rabbi's Office, Rabbi Dov Halbertal. Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us. Now, are more people in the Haredi community following the rules than breaking them today?
No, the most of the Haredi community, I would have said, it's a shame since the beginning of the corona. I mean, since 1 year, they are generally not keeping the rule. Almost, everything is open. I mean, the synagogues, the weddings, the schools, people are gathering together. I think it's the biggest clash in between religion and state that ever happened since the state began.
Well, now we've seen clips, like I said, of these mega weddings and these massive funeral processions, in addition to schools, synagogues, yeshivas staying open. What is the reason behind this defiance?
It's very difficult to understand it, but I can put 2 points. And I'm not justifying it anyhow. But the 2 points are, one, that we as a Haredi wing are very, very used to be together, social life, community life, 3 times a day in the synagogue for 2 hours in average altogether, and lessons and being together in all kind of festivals and Shabbat and with the rabbis and everything. It's very, very difficult the social to take social appeal in this aspect. That's one. And the second, I think, it can be more important in this view is that the sages, the rabbis are afraid of people and students and youth people being losing their religiosity or the level of their religion, being outside from the institutions, strolling in the streets and on the videos, on all kinds of those things. So they disobey the orders. There's not another word to say. They disobey the orders of the state.
All right, now, Rabbi, I know from your message before and on this program that more and more people in the ultra-Orthodox community and everywhere need to come into compliance. Thank you again so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And for more information, please visit our new and improved website at ILTV.tv. Make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for daily updates while you're there. Now, after a whirlwind 4 years, the end of an era has arrived. The Donald Trump administration finishing its last 24 hours in office ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. But of course, as we've seen with many previous presidencies, you can still do a lot in 24 hours.
As I conclude my term as the 45th President of the United States, I stand before you truly proud of what we have achieved together. We did what we came here to do, and so much more.
Leaving his mark as the final hours of his term count down, President Trump now on a spree of last-minute moves, including over 140 pardons or sentencing commutations and counting. And getting in on the action at both Israeli and American officials' request, President Trump has also issued a pardon now to Aviem Sela, an Israeli Air Force colonel indicted by the U.S. in 1987 for recruiting and handling Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard. Of course, beyond pardoning Sela, Trump's influence on the Middle East has been historic, particularly with respect to the Abraham Peace Accords, which ushered in 4 new normalization agreements between Jerusalem and the Arab world. And speaking with Israeli media, White House officials are reporting that had they had more time, Mauritania and Indonesia would be next. This as Trump bestowed the rare Legion of Merit Award on King Hamad of Bahrain on Tuesday, in acknowledgement of his extraordinary and courageous decision to normalize with Israel last year. Iran, on the other hand, celebrating the end of Trump's term and announcing symbolic sanctions to be placed on the president, Secretary of State Pompeo, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, CIA Chief Gina Haspel, and a number of other U.S. officials for alleged terrorism. Terrorism such as supporting Israel in its conflict with the Palestinian Authority and killing top IRGC Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani. Meanwhile, Israel is also continuing with some last-minute plans ahead of the beginning of the Biden-Harris White House, and starting with the approval of about 2,600 new settlement housing units in Judea and Samaria. This in addition to the nearly 800 new homes approved for construction in the West Bank just earlier this week. But heavy opposition to the move coming out from both within the current interim Israeli government as well as from the international community. EU officials, for one, meeting in Jerusalem with the Israeli Foreign Ministry to protest the new homes. Meanwhile, Defense Minister and Blue and White Party head Benny Gantz is calling the actions irresponsible, as he also blocks an additional attempt by Netanyahu to legalize 6 unrecognized outposts. Advocates pushing back, though, saying that most of the new units are in Jerusalem and Area C of the West Bank, both of which are entirely under Israeli administrative control. And Israeli officials continuing to argue that specifically the labeling of Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem as settlements is unfounded. Now, setting President Trump aside, the time has come for the Biden and Harris administration's inauguration. But following a very tight schedule for the transfer of powers, the new team is attempting to hit the ground running.
This week, we inaugurate a new administration and pray for its success in keeping America safe and prosperous. We extend our best wishes, and we also want them to have luck, a very important word.
Just a couple of hours to go before the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the United States' 46th president and vice president. But no time to lose, with Israel and the rest of the world waiting on pins and needles for the White House's new incoming foreign policies. And from Israel's perspective, this is especially true regarding 2 major issues: Iran and the Israel-Palestinian Authority conflict. That said, soon-to-be Secretary of State Antony Blinken taking the lead Tuesday night, getting ahead of some of the region's burning questions. First, with respect to Iran, Blinken explaining what many already know, and that the goal is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but with a hope of re-entering the controversial JCPOA agreement with Tehran, which Israel and other major regional powers reject as a mistake.
The president-elect believes that if Iran comes back into compliance, we would too, but we would use that as a platform with our allies and partners who would once again be on the same side with us to seek a longer and stronger agreement, and also, as you and the chairman have rightly pointed out, to capture these other issues, particularly with regard to missiles and Iran's destabilizing activities. That would be the objective.
Easing at least some fears in the Middle East, however, Blinken adds that it's vitally important to engage from the beginning with partners including Israel, Gulf countries, and other parties in the region before returning to the JCPOA. As for the question of Biden's position on Israel and Palestine, Blinken had this to say.
The president-elect believes, and I share this conviction, that the best way and maybe the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state and to give the Palestinians the state to which they are entitled is through the so-called two-state solution, obviously a solution that is very challenged at this moment.
We also know that the United States will likely return to a position of opposing Israeli settlement expansion, like the thousands just approved by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But the degree to which the Biden White House would pressure Israel into giving up annexations or construction in Judea and Samaria remains to be seen, as is the degree to which the United States will reverse its trends of sanctioning the PA for its payments to terrorists and other changes on the ground levied by the Trump administration. Biden is, however, expected to support the momentum of the Abraham Peace Accords and to respect the acknowledgement of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, as well as the relocation of the U.S. Embassy in kind. Here with more about what the Biden administration has in store for Israel and the Middle East, we turn to former diplomat and expert on Israel-U.S. relations, Nadav Tamir. Nadav, thanks so much for being with us now. In an op-ed by Ynet's Ben-Dror Yamini, Yamini says that Biden and Harris will be true Zionists in the White House. Do you agree?
Absolutely. They both have a long record of support for Israel, and so many years as vice president and senator, and also Kamala Harris in her career as a senator. There's a proven record of great support for Israel.
So what do you think Biden's main challenges, especially with respect to how Israel fits in, will be in the Middle East?
Well, he has a lot to do in the world in general, and the Middle East, unfortunately, is less of a priority than it used to have for America. It's not any longer the main energy resource for America, and most of the interventions in the Middle East were a catastrophe, whether it's Iraq or Libya or doing nothing in Syria. So the Americans want to do more in other places in the world. They want to deal with climate change. They have China. They have a lot of domestic challenges. But in terms of the Middle East, what they will try to do first is to get back to diplomacy with Iran in order to stop the ability of Iran to break to a bomb, to re-engage with the Palestinians and keep the two-state solution alive, even though, as the Secretary of State Blinken said, they're not going to have an immediate plan to get to negotiations. And they will try to use the regional developments in order to support their efforts towards Iran and towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right, well, Iran aside, because I think that whether or not Iran agrees to the recent changes or in policy from the United States remains to be seen. But with respect to the Palestinian Authority, getting them back on board, do you see the Biden administration maybe rolling back some of the Trump-era policies, for example, reducing payments and imposing sanctions on the Palestinian Authority over payments to terrorists?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, the Palestinians are making an effort now to change their policies in terms of money to prisoners in a way that will enable the Biden administration to renew the support for the Palestinians. But some of the things that have nothing to do with the prisoners will be renewed. The U.S. aid, the support for UNRWA, Probably a consulate in East Jerusalem, unless the Israeli government will create problems. Finding a formula for representation of the Palestinians in Washington, all of those things will be renewed, and they will try to reverse the positions and the actions of the Trump administration that were damaging the two-state solution and the relations of the U.S. with the moderate Palestinians.
All right, Nadav, Tamir, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Moving on, Israel has been experiencing some intense weather patterns over the last week. At least 5 Israelis, including a pregnant woman, even requiring rescue in light of the recent flooding. Chana Rifkin joins us now from the coast with more. Chana, what's it like out there?
Well, Aaron, we're here at the beach in Rishon LeZion, and it's pretty clear that it's windy. There have been scattered thunderstorms throughout the week, as well as rain showers. And in Nahariya, there's also been flooding, lots of flooding. Reports of at least 5 people having to be rescued from their cars.
Well, what's happening in the north today?
Well, actually, in Israel's north, up in the Mount Hermon resort, they received a significant amount of snowfall, 1 to 2 feet. That's about 40 to 70 centimeters. Weather is in the 30s, and that is -1 to -4 Celsius. Here we have some images from the resort, which is still closed due to coronavirus lockdown measures.
All right, Chana, thank you for the report.
Thanks, Aaron.
Now, for our final story tonight, we put the heavy behind us, thankfully, and focus on the light, as Israeli pensioners, flush with new anti-COVID antibodies, celebrate their newly regained freedom. Roughly a quarter of Israelis are now immune or nearly immune to the ravages of the deadly coronavirus pandemic. And with most of the inoculated coming from the elderly community, pensioner parties like this one are thankfully becoming more and more common every day.
It's so great. Thank goodness we get the second vaccine today. We are celebrating. We are going to be free to get out, to meet our families, friends, enjoy life the way we know how to do it. The way we were used to about a year ago. We will get back to normal life, my friends.
We have decided to celebrate. We know that stress and anxiety suppress the immune system, and by dancing, singing, and having this party you see behind me, we're actually boosting the immune system and preparing it for the vaccine. And we all know and hope that that vaccine will work for 100% of our residents.
Again, though, health officials are reminding the public to enjoy the relief, but stay vigilant in wearing masks and keeping personal distance, especially as 300,000 Israelis over the age of 60 still have yet to get their first vaccine doses. And also, vaccinated individuals might still pass on the virus to the unprotected. And now we go back to Chana Rifkin for the daily weather forecast.
Well, today has been declared the coldest day of the year here in Israel, with rainy weather expected tonight and tomorrow throughout most of the country. So, grab that hot cocoa and cuddle up on the couch. Lows tonight are averaging about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 5 degrees Celsius, and tomorrow's highs are going to average about 59 degrees Fahrenheit and 15 degrees Celsius.
All right, thank you, Chana. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Oh, that doesn't look good. Oh. I can't tell if this driver is intending to go down this path or not.
את בסדר?
Oh, wow.
זה הכי חשוב. קודם כל, עברת את זה, מושלם. איך הלב?
עצרתי עם האנדברקס.
בסדר?
כן, איזה קטע.
Thank God for handbrakes. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.25 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Then, of course, don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and let us know what you think. Subscribe to our newsletter, by the way, for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Be healthy. Thank you so much for watching.